You're refilling the coffee station in the client lounge at 8:40 on a Tuesday morning, the kind of task that falls to the newest client associate at a private wealth office. When you glance at the open folder on the conference table, nobody's closed yet. A net worth statement, printed for a 9 a.m. meeting, the paper still warm from the printer down the hall. $14.2 million. You've seen bigger numbers cross this table in your 6 months here. This isn't even the largest client on your floor, but something about the account activity underneath the total catches your eye before you look away and finish the coffee. The checking account has $3,400 in it, less than what sits in your own savings account right now. You almost laugh, standing there with the coffee pot in your hand, the smell of it filling the small lounge, because it doesn't make sense at first glance. A person worth $14 million keeping less in checking than you do. You glance around, half expecting someone to notice you looking, but the lounge is empty except for the low hum of the espresso machine warming up for the morning's first meeting. Then it clicks, the way these things have been clicking for you all year, one client file at a time. The money isn't gone. It's just not sitting still anywhere close to where it could get spent by accident. You don't know it yet, standing there at the coffee station, but this is the first of 6 things you're about to spend the rest of the year quietly learning from people who will never know they taught you anything at all. The client whose folder you saw that morning is a woman named Claudia Reyes, 61, who built a chain of urgent care clinics over 3 decades before selling her stake 4 years ago. You never meet her directly. Associates mostly process paperwork and sit in on meetings to take notes, but you read her account structure closely enough over the following weeks to understand something your own bank account had never once done. Every month, on the same day, a fixed percentage of every dollar that touches her checking account gets swept automatically into 3 other places: a brokerage account, a donor-advised fund, and a reserve account her advisor calls the float. It happens before she ever looks at the number. It happened, apparently, back when the clinics were still new and her personal paycheck was $4,200 a month, long before any of this became $14 million. Her advisor, a soft-spoken man named Desmond, who's been with her since year 2 of the business, mentioned once in a meeting you were transcribing notes for that Claudia's rule has never changed in 28 years. Whatever moves, moves first, before rent, before payroll, before anything else gets touched. You found yourself thinking about that meeting for days afterward, mostly because it contradicted something you'd always assumed, that automation was a luxury reserved for people who already had enough money, that missing a little of it wouldn't hurt. Claudia's version of the rule started at $4,200 a month, before 3 clinics existed. Before any of this was guaranteed to work out at all. The mechanism came first, the scale came later, and only because the mechanism had already been running long enough to compound into something larger. You go home that same week and do something you'd been meaning to do for over a year. You open your bank's automatic transfer settings and set 12% of your paycheck to move into a brokerage account the same day your direct deposit lands, 2 days before you'd normally start paying bills. It's not a big percentage. It's not going to make you Claudia Reyes, but you notice, within the first month, that you stop thinking of it as money you're choosing to save, and start thinking of it as money that was never really available to spend in the first place. The exact distinction Desmond had described, just with 3 fewer zeros attached to it. Currently, most financial guidance tells people to save whatever's left over at the end of the month, and most people, predictably, find that whatever's left over is close to nothing. Claudia's version reverses the order entirely. The saving happens first, automatically, and the rest of life gets built around whatever remains. That single reversal, repeated for 28 years without exception, is doing more of the actual work in her file than any single investment decision you've seen cross that conference table all year. You ran a rough version of the math yourself one evening, mostly out of curiosity about what 28 years of the same habit could actually produce. 12% of a modest, unremarkable salary invested consistently and left alone compounds into a genuinely different life by the time it's had 3 decades to work. Not because the percentage itself is dramatic, but because the habit never got interrupted by a single month of, "I'll start again next paycheck." Claudia's version never had that interruption. Yours, so far, hasn't either, though you're aware that the real test isn't the first month. It's the 100th one. the one that happens on an ordinary Tuesday nobody's watching. A few months later, you sit in on a review for a different client, a man named Arthur Kessler, who made his money slowly over 4 decades, running 3 car dealerships in the same county. Arthur's file looks nothing like a single, undifferentiated pile of money. It's broken into what Desmond calls buckets, an operating account that covers ordinary life, a growth account that only ever gets invested and never spent, an opportunity account sitting mostly in cash for deals that come up unpredictably, and a legacy account he's never touched in 11 years, earmarked specifically for his grandchildren's education. You ask Desmond, a little sheepishly, why it matters whether the buckets are separate if it's all technically the same person's money. He tells you something that reframes the whole idea for you. Money without a job attached to it gets spent on whatever's in front of you, almost automatically, because your brain doesn't distinguish money for emergencies from money for a nicer dinner, unless the accounts themselves draw that line for you. Arthur, he says, has never once dipped into the growth account for a car repair, not because he's disciplined in some abstract sense, but because the account genuinely doesn't feel available for that purpose. The structure is doing the discipline so Arthur doesn't have to rely on willpower every single week. Desmond mentioned an anecdote from years earlier that stuck with you. A different client, long gone from the firm by the time you arrived, who kept everything in one single account for decades and could never explain at the end of any given year where the money had actually gone. Not because he was reckless, just because an undifferentiated pile of money sitting in one place invites every reasonable-sounding purchase to compete against every other reasonable-sounding purchase, with nothing drawing a line between the account this is allowed to come from and the account this definitely isn't. Arthur's structure goes a step further than you initially realized. Each bucket isn't just a separate account. It's held at a different institution entirely, with the growth account specifically chosen for how inconvenient it is to access on short notice. A small deliberate friction, Desmond called a speed bump for your own worst impulses. Arthur has joked, apparently, that the account is boring on purpose, in a location he has to actually think about before transferring out of, which has saved him from at least 2 purchases over the years he now admits he would have regretted. You've noticed the same principle showing up in smaller ways across other files too. Clients who keep their opportunity cash at a different bank than their everyday checking, not because the interest rate is meaningfully better, but because the extra login, the extra 2 minutes of friction, is enough to turn an impulsive transfer into a decision made the next morning instead. Once the initial pull has usually faded on its own, you open 2 new accounts that weekend, both free, both at the same bank you already use, one labeled plainly, "Emergencies do not touch," the other, "Investing only." You move $60 a week into each, alongside the 12% already sweeping into your brokerage account from Chapter 1. It feels almost silly at first, moving small amounts into accounts with names that sound like they're pretending to be something bigger than they are. But 3 months later, when your car needs a $780 repair, you don't feel the familiar tightening in your chest you felt at that exact kind of bill for years. The money for it already had a job. It had been waiting the whole time, doing absolutely nothing except existing for this exact moment. Your coworker Tanner, who started at the firm the same week you did, financed a 2024 Tacoma the month he got his signing bonus, $640 a month, 6 years, nothing down. He mentioned it at lunch with the same pride you remember. Claudia's early paycheck stubs probably didn't carry, back when $4,200 a month felt like a lot of money to her too. You don't judge Tanner for it. You understand the pull of wanting something to point to, especially in a job surrounded all day by other people's very visible wealth. What you've noticed, sitting through client meetings all year, is that the wealthiest files on your floor aren't debt-free. Arthur still carries a mortgage on his primary residence at a rate locked in years ago, low enough that paying it off early would actually cost him money relative to what that same cash could earn invested elsewhere. Claudia used a business line of credit twice during the clinic's expansion years, both times to buy equipment that generated more revenue than the loan's interest cost her. The debt in these files isn't absent. It's aimed at things that either appreciate or generate income. And it's never used to fund something that loses value the moment you drive it off a lot. Desmond explained it to you once, almost offhandedly, while you were filing paperwork together after a meeting. The actual test he uses with new clients isn't how much debt do you have, it's what is the debt attached to. A mortgage on a house that's appreciating, a loan on equipment that generates revenue, a line of credit used to buy inventory that sells at a profit. All of that debt is working for the person who owes it. A loan on a truck that's worth less every single month, financed at a payment that competes directly with the same automatic transfers from Chapters 1 and 2, is debt working against the person who owes it, regardless of how it feels sitting in the driver's seat. Tanner's Tacoma, by comparison, will be worth less than what he owes on it for at least the first 18 months of the loan. A fact he didn't know until you mentioned it gently over lunch. One day, more out of genuine concern than superiority, he got quiet for a second, the way people do when a number rearranges something, and asked how you'd even know that. You told him the truth. You'd started actually reading the amortization schedules on the client files that cross your desk. Not because anyone asked you to, but because you'd started to realize the difference between good and bad debt wasn't a moral one, it was just a question of what the money was pointed at. Currently, the average new vehicle loses roughly 20% of its value in the first year alone, and financing that depreciation at 6 or 7% interest on top of it means paying steadily rising interest on an asset that's simultaneously losing value in the opposite direction. A mismatch that's easy to miss when the monthly payment is the only number anyone actually looks at. None of the files on your floor carry that particular mismatch. Not because those clients never buy nice cars. Arthur drives a car nicer than anything you'll own for years, but because he paid cash for it, 4 years after the dealership business had already proven itself, rather than financing it during a year when every dollar still had somewhere more urgent to be. Desmond mentioned something in a meeting last spring that you wrote down word for word, mostly because it contradicted almost everything you'd assumed about how wealthy people track their own progress. None of the clients on your floor, he said, obsess over their monthly income the way most people do. Several of them, including Arthur, took actual pay cuts at different points in their careers, reinvesting profits back into the dealerships instead of drawing a bigger personal salary, because the number that actually mattered to them wasn't what hit their checking account every 2 weeks. It was the number at the bottom of a quarterly net worth statement, the one that accounts for everything they own minus everything they owe. He pulled up an old file for illustration from a client who'd since passed the account to his children and showed you a decade of quarterly statements sitting in a folder nobody had looked at in years. The client's reported income barely changed across those 10 years, his net worth nearly quadrupled. Desmond tapped the screen and said that was the entire difference in a single folder. Income is what somebody pays you, but net worth is what you actually get to keep. And the two numbers can move in almost completely unrelated directions, depending on what you do with the first one. You'd never actually calculated your own net worth before that meeting, mostly because the idea felt reserved for people with enough assets to make the math interesting. You did it that weekend anyway, sitting at your kitchen table with your laptop open. Checking, savings, the new brokerage account, minus your remaining student loan and car balance. The number that came out was $6,400. It didn't feel like much. You almost didn't write it down at all. The number felt so small next to the files crossing your desk every day. But you did anyway, the way Arthur's file gets updated every quarter. And promised yourself you'd check it again in 3 months rather than obsessing over your paycheck in the meantime. 3 months later, the number was $9,100. Not from a raise, not from anything dramatic, just the automatic transfers from Chapters 1 and 2 doing what they'd been set up to do, quietly, while you went about an entirely ordinary set of months. Currently, roughly half of Americans have never calculated their own net worth, mostly because nobody ever taught them the habit, and because income feels like the more natural thing to track since it shows up so visibly every payday. The clients on your floor track the opposite number, and it's not a small distinction. Income is water flowing through a bucket, and net worth is how much is actually staying in it. There was an adjustment period to this new way of looking, one you hadn't expected. You caught yourself a few times that first quarter, checking your paycheck stub the way you always had out of sheer habit, feeling the old flicker of satisfaction or disappointment depending on whether a bonus had landed. It took actual, repeated effort to redirect that same attention toward the quarterly number instead. To feel the small satisfaction of $9,100 the way you used to feel it about a good paycheck, and to let a merely average paycheck stop carrying the emotional weight it used to. You assumed, walking into this job, that clients like Arthur and Claudia hired advisors like Desmond only once they'd already become wealthy, a reward for success rather than a tool used to build it. You learned, reading through Arthur's file history, that this was backward. He hired his first accountant at 34 when his single dealership was still barely profitable, specifically because he kept making small, avoidable tax mistakes that a professional could have caught in an afternoon. The accountant's fee that first year was $600. It saved him almost $2,200 in errors he'd made the year before, on income that, at the time, was a fraction of what it eventually became. Desmond mentioned that Arthur still tells a version of the story to younger clients who hesitate over the cost of professional help, that he almost didn't hire the accountant at all that first year, because $600 felt like real money against a business that wasn't yet reliably profitable. What changed his mind apparently was doing the actual math on the previous year's mistakes and realizing the fee wasn't a cost so much as a bet, with better odds than almost anything else he could have spent that money on. You mentioned this to your own accountant this spring, a modest, unglamorous appointment you'd been putting off for 2 years, mostly because you assumed your finances were too simple to need one. It took 40 minutes and cost $180. She found that you'd been eligible for a deduction related to your student loan interest that you'd never claimed on your last 2 returns, worth $340 combined. It wasn't life-changing money, but it was more than the appointment cost, in the same quiet, unglamorous ratio that had made Arthur's first accountant worth hiring decades before he had anything resembling real wealth. The lesson isn't that you need a team of specialists at $6,400 in net worth, the way Claudia has at $14 million. It's that the habit of bringing in expertise before a mistake happens, rather than after, is available at every single stage of the process, and almost nobody uses it until the stakes feel large enough to justify the fee. By the time the stakes feel that large, you've usually already paid for several years of mistakes a professional would have caught for a fraction of the cost. Desmond put it in terms that stuck with you longer than the specific dollar figures did. He said most people treat professional advice like a reward they'll earn once they're already successful enough to deserve it, when the actual function of that advice is closer to scaffolding, something that helps the structure go up straighter in the first place, rather than something you admire only after the building's already finished. Arthur's first accountant wasn't a luxury purchased by a wealthy man. He was a $600 bet, made by someone barely breaking even, that paid for itself within a single tax season. The one thing every file on your floor has in common, regardless of how the money was made, is a section near the back that almost never gets discussed in the actual client meetings. Insurance, a will, beneficiary designations, all quietly in place, all reviewed roughly once a year in a conversation that takes 15 minutes and generates no excitement whatsoever. Desmond mentioned once that new clients almost always want to talk about growth first, the next investment, the next opportunity, and almost always need to be redirected gently to the boring section of the file before anything else gets discussed. You sat in on a meeting in early fall where a client's estate attorney walked through what happens procedurally when none of this paperwork exists, the specific months-long delay that follows a death without a will, the legal costs that pile up resolving disputes that a single signed document would have prevented, the way accounts get frozen at exactly the moment the people left behind need access to them least complicated. Nobody in that meeting looked bored. Everybody looked like they were doing quiet math about their own paperwork, the same way you found yourself doing. You didn't have a will. You didn't have any real insurance beyond what your employer automatically provided. You fixed both over a single weekend this fall, mostly out of embarrassment after transcribing notes for that meeting. A basic will through an online service cost you $159, took about 90 minutes of answering questions about who gets what, and who you'd trust with decisions if you couldn't make them yourself. A term life policy, given your age and health, came to $19 a month, less than a single lunch out. None of it felt like progress in the way the brokerage account did. There's no balance to watch grow, No number that goes up on a Sunday morning. But Desmond said something about this section of the file that stuck with you longer than almost anything else you learned all year. Growth without protection isn't wealth. It's just an unprotected number, waiting for the one bad month that undoes years of good ones. Arthur's file, he mentioned, survived a serious health scare 8 years ago, specifically because the boring paperwork had already been sitting there, quietly, for over a decade before anyone needed it. You mentioned the will and the policy to your mother on a phone call afterward, mostly in passing, and she went quiet for a second before admitting she and your father still didn't have updated versions of their own, something they'd been meaning to handle for years. You didn't lecture her about it. You just told her what the $159 and the 90 minutes had actually involved, the same unglamorous way Desmond had described it to you, and she said she'd look into it that week. You don't know yet whether she did, but the conversation itself felt like its own small, quiet extension of everything you'd been learning all year, the habit spreading sideways, one ordinary phone call at a time, without anyone needing $14 million first. You're back at the coffee station on an ordinary Tuesday almost a year after the morning you first saw Claudia's file left open on the conference table. The same espresso machine hums through its warm-up cycle. The same folder-strewn conference table waits for whatever meeting is coming at 9. Your own net worth, last you checked, sits at $14,900. Nowhere near hers, not by any stretch. And you're not pretending otherwise. But the 6 things sitting quietly underneath that number are, mechanically, identical to the 6 things sitting underneath hers. The automatic transfer that moves before you see the money, the separate accounts that give every dollar a job, the debt aimed at things that grow instead of things that depreciate, the number you track every quarter instead of every payday, the 40-minute appointment that catches mistakes before they compound, the boring paperwork in the back of the file that nobody wants to talk about first. Tanner asked you last week, half joking, how you'd gotten so into all of this, watching you calculate something on your phone at lunch instead of scrolling. You told him the truth, the same way Desmond had told you the truth all year, without any of it feeling like a lecture. None of it required $14 million to start. It required exactly what it required for Claudia at $4,200 a month, and for Arthur back when his one dealership barely broke even. The decision to run the same mechanism at whatever scale you're actually at, rather than waiting for a scale that would make the mechanism feel more deserved. Tanner didn't sign up for anything on the spot, but he asked a few more questions than usual. And you suspect, the way you once suspected about your own eventual $6,400 becoming $9,100, that something in the conversation is going to sit with him longer than he expects it to. You think, walking back to your desk, about how none of the 6 things you learned this year ever showed up in a single dramatic meeting. They arrived scattered across a folder here, an offhand comment from Desmond there, an amortization schedule you weren't required to read, but read anyway. Nobody sat you down and taught you any of this on purpose. You just paid attention for a year to people who'd already spent decades running a version of the same mechanism you're only now starting to build for yourself. You finish refilling the coffee station, the same task it was a year ago, and head back to your desk for another ordinary Tuesday of paperwork that isn't yours. Somewhere on this floor, a client you'll never meet is having a 15-minute conversation about a will nobody wants to think about, or a quarterly review that barely moves the needle, or a debt decision that looks nothing like what everyone assumes wealth is supposed to look like from the outside. None of it will make headlines. None of it ever has. What would it look like to run your own 6 months from today, at whatever number you're actually starting from, instead of waiting for a bigger one to arrive first?